Hey everyone, I'm Alex, and today on Big Out Books, I'm going to be doing part 3 of my July wrap-up. I'm having a very hard time coming to grips with the fact that the summer is already halfway over. Don't want to talk about it, but I would like to talk about these books. I've got 8 books to show you today, quite a mixed bag. I've got some Greek mythology, some Shakespeare, and some Irvine Welsh, so let's get into it. I'm going to start off today talking about my favorite and least favorite read of the month, and they both have to do with Greek mythology, so it makes sense to pair them together. So the first one is Metamorphoses by Ovid. This is a Roman epic poem that is quite ambitious in scope. You start off at the beginning of the poem with the story of the creation of the world, and it takes you all the way up until the reign of Julius Caesar. So there's a lot of history going on throughout this book, and it is full of so many stories from Greek and Roman mythology. And most of these stories are connected to this theme of metamorphosis, or transformation, where this one character takes on a new form by the end of the story. This is a classic that I've been meaning to read for a very long time. So I play the oboe, and one of our most famous pieces of solo oboe repertoire is actually a piece by Benjamin Britten, and it's inspired by some of the stories from Ovid's Metamorphoses. So I started learning that piece as a teenager, and ever since then I've been like, man, I actually need to read these stories in their original because I thought the music was just so fascinating, and this book did not let me down. When I first started this, I was worried that it was going to take me forever to get through. It's quite long, over 500 pages of poetry, and I thought that the subject matter might get a little repetitive. I mean, how many times can you really read about someone turning into a tree and still have it be a fresh and engaging narrative? But I was just so wrong. I really flew through this a lot quicker than I expected that I was going to. The real reason why I loved this book so much is that it is just full of all the stories. Like, it is just story after story after story. Ovid crafts these really engaging narratives. You have one person telling this tale, and then the person that they tell it to, it reminds them of something, and they'll tell this story of transformation, and it just goes on and on. So it is really a compilation of all the juiciest incidents from mythology. If you're a fan of Greek mythology, then this is going to read like some kind of bananas crossover episode, because it just has all of the characters that you know. They're just coming in and out, and you're hearing their story, and it's often from a fresh perspective. So a lot of these myths you'll find in other places. Ovid covers some of the material that you'll find in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and some of the material from the Aeneid as well, but you're getting it from a different perspective. He's interested in different elements of the story than you might have seen before. Some of these characters and gods from Greek mythologies you're seeing in new lights, although, of course, with the gods, a lot of the times they are not coming across as very pleasant, as they're often chasing women down and forcing them to have their children, so that's kind of a very unpleasant element of this. You feel bad for a lot of the mortals in this book. I read the translation by Charles Martin, which I really enjoyed. It was just very smooth and effortless to read this poetry. It made it so much more of a pleasant experience than I was expecting, and he also takes some creative risks in his translation that, in my opinion, seemed to really pay off. The craziest moment of this translation is when the daughters of Pyrrhus challenge the Muses to a singing competition, except Charles Martin turns it into a rap battle. So he calls them the Pierides, and I kid you not, like, they're throwing down lines like this. Please forgive me for what I'm about to do. I'm just quoting the book. In Libya, the giants told the gods to scram. The boss god they worship there has horns like a ram. 'Cause Jupiter laid low as the leader of a flock, and Delius, his homie, really got a shock when the giants left him with no place to go. Forget about Apollo, make him a crow. I really could not have predicted that there was going to be a rap battle in the middle of the Metamorphoses, but there was, and I was just living for it. I really enjoyed this translation, and I thought it was beautiful, and I love this so much. It's probably the best thing that I've read this year so far, so cannot recommend this highly enough. Right as I was wrapping up with Ovid, my reading highlight of the year so far, I then encountered Gods Behaving Badly by Marie Phillips, which has been my worst book of the year so far. Part of the reason that this was such a disaster for me is I was coming off a real high of reading Ovid. He is obviously a well-renowned poet who has withstood the test of time, and he is just such a master of narrative and poetry, and he really knows how to string a story together. And then I encountered this book, and it was just the complete opposite. There was no poetry in the language. There was no creativity with the way that the story is told, and it was just very generic and formulaic. This book takes the Greek gods and places them in a contemporary context. So in this story, the gods are still alive, but nobody believes in them anymore, so their powers are drastically reduced. They're living in a decrepit house in London, and many of them feel lost. They're living without a purpose, and they are missing the good old days. It seemed like a fun premise to see the gods in this present-day context, and they all have kind of ridiculous jobs, where Apollo is like a TV talk show host psychic, and Aphrodite works a phone sex hotline, and Artemis is a dog walker. So little things like that were cute, but the problem with this book is it just did not develop beyond that. And Marie Phillips seemed to have just a very shallow understanding of who these gods were. So a lot of the times their characters were just reduced to this like one little joke about them. Like, did you know Aphrodite is obsessed with sex? Right? When obviously her character is a lot more complicated than that. She's a bit more than just that shallow sensualist. My other main problem with this book is that it's actually not entirely about the gods, but it's also about these two mortals who get sort of twisted up in their lives, and these characters were just the most boring people that I had ever read about. And I get that that was the point. They're supposed to be the everyman kind of hero, but they were just so soporific to read about. I could not care at all about their story. I couldn't, and it didn't help that this plot is just so formulaic. Like, this is like any kind of rescue adventure movie that you've ever seen before. Like, you know exactly where this story is going. I didn't like her sense of humor. I feel like it kind of grated on me instead of kept me entertained. It was like a weird mix of it being really tedious and really aggravating in a way that I did not love. So I really wouldn't recommend this book. If you want to read about the Greek gods, just read the myths. Just go back in history. They're not that scary. They're pretty accessible, and it is a lot more substantial and worthwhile than kind of silly stuff like this. So yeah, this book was not for me, and I kind of wish it never happened, but it did, so I will try to move forward and forget all about it. Rant over, we are now moving along to bigger and better things. I read 2 Shakespeare plays this month. I read A Midsummer Night's Dream and Titus Andronicus. These were both 2 plays that I had never read before. And what was funny about the 2 of them is that they are highly influenced by the Metamorphoses of Ovid. So what I didn't know is actually Shakespeare really loved the Metamorphoses. It was one of his favorite books, apparently. So he works in a lot of the myths from Ovid into his plays. So that made a really rewarding kind of crossover reading experience for me. I enjoyed both of these plays quite a lot. A Midsummer Night's Dream was very delightful, and this is one I was kind of put off from reading since I knew it was going to be about fairies and stuff like that. I didn't think that it was going to be a play that I'd like. I'm really into the bloody and gory side of Shakespeare, but I have to say I was quite charmed by this. I mean, it's just very silly. You've got a few different groups of characters in this play. You have the fairies that are unleashing their magic and causing some strange things to happen, and then the young lovers who their magic is quite interfering with as they shift associations for each other, which was kind of frustrating and comical as a plot. And my favorite group, of course, were the amateur theater players. I thought they were so charming. They're these kind of working guys that are just coming together, and they're trying to put on a production of Pyramus and Thisbe for this royal wedding that's happening. Their train wreck performance of this play in Act 5 was my favorite part of this play, maybe because I'm someone who loves The Room. I'm clearly very passionate about bad acting, so I just enjoyed that scene. And you've also got these spectators who are just roasting this play that's happening in front of them. It was just a lot of fun. So if you're looking for something light and fun, Midsummer's Night's Dream will do the job. Titus Andronicus, on the other hand, is something completely different. When I was saying earlier that I loved the violent and gory side of Shakespeare, this one definitely fit the bill. I don't know if you can see what's going on in this cover here with the hands and the tongue getting chopped off, but that's just a small preview of what's going to be going on in this crazy play. The introduction of this play talks about how it historically has been viewed as quite a blemish on Shakespeare's output, and a lot of people, particularly in the Victorian period, did not go for all the violence in this play, and it was really viewed as an embarrassment. And they were also wondering if Shakespeare, since it's one of his earlier tragedies, was trying to make a name for himself on the scene by just kind of being over the top and shocking. So while this one is not universally admired, I am still glad I gave this one a go because I thought it was pretty fun, especially on a plot level. Like, it starts off right from the beginning with a lot of killing, and it just doesn't let up until the end. And it culminates in this masterpiece of a scene where two sons are killed and served in a pie and fed to their mother. So theater doesn't get better than that, right? Like, that's just incredible. So while it doesn't contain the poetic genius or brilliant soliloquies that you might find in some of his other tragedies, I thought this one was just weird. So that was enough to keep me interested. Also, I love a good Shakespearean villain, and Aaron the Moor was so twisted. Like, he is a guy who just likes to be terrible for the sake of it. Like, he just enjoys causing as much drama and trouble as he possibly can. So I found him to be a fascinating character, although it's also quite a racist portrayal since his evil personality is connected often to his dark skin. So that part wasn't great, but I did think that he was a fascinating villain, and I wanted to watch him and see what he was going to do throughout the whole play. Apparently there is a film version of this starring Anthony Hopkins, who I loved when he portrayed Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs, so I'm thinking I'm going to have to check that one out. But really, I've just been enjoying chilling with Shakespeare this summer. I try to read it out on my balcony, read it out loud to myself like a crazy person, and try to get through one act a night so that I can finish up a play in about 5 days, and it's quite pleasant. So I think I'm going to keep that going, keep reading some more Shakespeare, so I would love to hear from you. Is there a Shakespeare play that you feel like is underrated and deserves some more attention? Because I would love to know as I'm starting to pick out which plays that I might have missed or I haven't gotten around to yet so that I can keep on reading some Shakespeare this summer. Next up, I have a long historical fiction novel. This is As Meat Loves Salt by Maria McCann. This book is set in England during the 1640s, which is during the Civil War, where Oliver Cromwell and his new model army are rising up and fighting the royalists. I don't know a lot about this historical period, but I found that I really didn't need to, in that Maria McCann would explain things very naturally as you would go along through the text. The main character of this book, Jacob, starts off as a servant in a well-to-do household, but things go disastrously wrong for him on his wedding day, which is clearly all mentioned here on the back summary of the book, but for some reason was like a big surprise to me when I read it the first time around. So I clearly don't read these plot summaries very closely because I was just like, what? This is a crazy plot twist. It really wasn't. It's apparently just a part of the book that you should know about going into it. But basically, Jacob then has to leave his house, he has to leave his family, and he ends up as a member of Cromwell's new model army. And the battle scenes in this book were really intense. Maria McCann really takes you into these scenes. She makes it a very sensory experience, which of course is not always pleasant. She talks about how the soldiers would pee a lot before battle because of their nerves, so you really can smell these urine-drenched fields that they're about to fight on. Or she talks about like the heaviness of the pikes that they had to operate, or what it smells like when you disembowel someone. So it was really gory in a way that was quite engaging. There's also a gay romance at the heart of this story, where Jacob ends up leaving the army with a friend of his. They live in London for a while this friend plans on starting a colony. So he's basically a communist. He wants to live a communal lifestyle with a group of people where they don't own property. It's a controversial way of living, and you can see in this book what ends up happening to this colony. But it was a very fascinating relationship that these two men had together, and the power dynamics were constantly shifting. Of course, nothing is easy about their relationship. Jacob has a lot of issues in his mind with religion and thinking that he's going to burn in hell for these feelings of his, as well as they have to be very secretive because you cannot be open about this kind of relationship at the time. So it was really stressful reading about their relationship, and the two of them were just such intense personalities that it was always keeping you on the edge of your seat. Like, I was always very nervous with this book, wondering where it was going to go. Also, the main character hears voices in his head, so you know that that is going to lead to something intense. So this book was a slow burn for me, but it was quite intense and gripping the whole way through, and it did lead to a pretty big climax. So I will say that this was a really great historical fiction read. It captured so many aspects of life at the time, in the city, in the army, in the country, on a commune. Like, you're just bouncing around all over the place, yet there were these really compelling yet difficult characters at the center of this story, so I would highly recommend this one as well. Next, I have a quick little nonfiction book to show you. This is Ex Libris by Fadiman. All of these essays are about incredibly nerdy literary topics. So you've got essays about inscriptions written in the front of the book, or what it's like to read a book while you're at the place where it was written about. The first chapter is actually my favorite. It's an essay about the torture and agony that Anne went through when she decided to merge her library with her husband. And this was a few years after they got married. But I think, you know, as someone who's like a book owner, that's such a difficult thing to do, right? How do you blend the books once they go together? You know, that is more symbolic than the marriage itself. Anne is very passionate about the subjects that she writes about. Sometimes it seems like she's taking things a little bit too far. Like, here's one passage. This is about book organization. She's talking about some friends of hers that had hired an interior decorator. And I quote, "When they returned, they discovered their entire library had been reorganized by color and size. Shortly thereafter, the decorator met with a fatal automobile accident. I confess that when this story was told, everyone around the dinner table concurred that justice had been served." So, you know, she's going a little extreme sometimes, but she's got, yeah, this weird sense of humor. It becomes endearing almost. Like, she's just so, like, intense and passionate about literature that you just, you know, you learn to deal with her quirks, and I really did grow fond of her while reading these essays. I was reading this book one day, sitting on a park bench, minding my own business, and then I was approached by some skater guys, and they were trying to ask me, oh, you know, what are you reading? And I really could not find a way to explain this to them. I was going to say, oh, you don't want to know, like, it's so nerdy. And they're like, oh, no, what are you reading? And I was like, this is a book about books. And then after that, that really cleared them off. That made them walk away. So this is probably one of the nerdiest books that you can find. But if you're passionate about reading as well, I think you'll find a lot to love about this little collection. The last two books that I have to talk about are the latest in the Trainspotting series by Irvine Welsh. If you're not familiar with the Trainspotting series, it all starts off with this bad boy, Trainspotting, probably more famous for being a movie starring Ewan McGregor. It is honestly at the point where I feel like I love the book and the movie in equal proportions. Like, they're just both so wonderful, even though they're highly depressing and it's about heroin addiction. So you've got these Scottish junkies, yet there is also a lot of warmth and humor to these tales. Then Irvine Welsh wrote a sequel called Porno. This is where you see the few of the main characters from Trainspotting. They're coming together, trying to make an adult film and make some money off of that, and of course it all backfires like it always does in these books. Then Irvine Welsh wrote a prequel. This is Skag Boys. This gives you some more background on the characters before Trainspotting. And then we've got these two, which I have just recently read. The first one is The Blade Artist, and this one is a little bit different because it is just centered around one of the main characters from Trainspotting. The Blade Artist is all about Begbie, who is the psychopath of the group. He is just the friend that has extreme anger issues and is just always fighting everyone around him, and he's just a very troubled individual. This book, however, reincarnates him as Jim Francis. He is now living in California with a beautiful wife and two daughters, and he has made it, and he's a successful artist. Bigby is almost unrecognizable. He really doesn't seem like the same man, but then when one of his sons from his first marriage dies, he has to go back to Scotland, and he ends up getting involved in a shady scene, and you have to see whether or not Bigby has really changed as much as we think that he might have. So this book, honestly, it's short, but it kind of took me a long time to get through because I wasn't always enjoying it, but it does have quite a bit of payoff in the end. There were definitely some funny moments to this one, but it just wasn't quite the same when you didn't have all the members of the gang. So it was just weird to be just focusing on this one person. I much prefer Dead Men's Trousers, as this is a book where you get to see all of the characters back in action and interacting with each other and just being their bad selves. So the kind of gimmick with this book is that one of the 4 main characters is wearing Dead Men's Trousers and is going to die by the end of this book. It seemed kind of predictable which member of the group was going to die, so that element wasn't quite as exciting as it could have been. It wasn't really like a big plot point, it was just kind of like sad. It was like, oh, this person's dead now, but I won't give that away. But even though it did have that kind of sad part, there were just a lot of hilarious, ridiculous, over-the-top scenes. There's one scene when a bunch of these guys get in a bit over their head with this Scottish gangster, and they end up having to remove their friend's kidney in a very unprofessional operational setting. So like scenes like that are just wild, and you just don't encounter those anywhere else. It's hard for me to be objective about these books because I'm just so bonded to the characters that really, if you give me episodes where they're together and getting into trouble, I'm going to be happy and read it. So no, this isn't your literature with a capital L, but it is still just really fun storytelling if you're into the gritty, seedy, unsavory side of life, right? Everything in these books are kind of disgusting and unsavory, yet at the same time, these characters are hitting middle age, they're growing up, they're trying to live respectable lives, they have kids, they have careers, and yet they're still these very strange people who make these very terrible decisions. So I have to say this was a very solid edition. I think this might be my favorite book that has come out since Trainspotting. So I thought this one was a lot of fun, and I'm always happy to revisit the Trainspotting series. So I don't know if Irvine Welsh plans to continue writing about these guys, but I really hope he does, because I feel like he has fun while he writes about them. I have fun reading about it. It's just a good partnership. Also, this book has a lot of skeletons to admire, so that's something that we can all enjoy, right? So those are the books that I read this July. Let me know if you have any thoughts about these books in the comments down below, and I would especially love to hear from you if you have any recommendations or suggestions for Shakespearean plays that you think that I should read next. If you think that any of the plays are underrated, or if there's a particular play that you think I might enjoy, I would love to hear from you. I'm thinking about starting to head into his histories, and I haven't read any of those before, so if you have any expertise on that topic, I would love to know. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again later in August.